Okay, I have 4:45 on my watch here. So I'd like to go ahead and get started. I will first start out with a roll call. So we can make sure that our members are here. Karen Corbett Sanders. Ms. Marin.
Here.
Ms. McLaughlin.
Here.
Ms. Derna Kofax.
Here.
Dr. Anderson.
Present.
Mr. Frisch. Ms. Cohen.
Here.
Karen Keys-Gamarra.
Here.
Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
I'm here.
Ms. Amish.
We're here.
Ms. Bakarski. Let's try Karen Corbett Sanders. Mr. Frisch.
Ms. Tolan, I said I was here before and I'm still here.
Oh,
We didn't
okay.
hear you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. Ms. Bakarski. I can see you. Stella, is your audio working?
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
No, now I can. Thank you. And Mr. Frisch.
I'm here.
Okay, here we go. Okay, great. We have everyone in attendance. So our next discussion is on SR&R. And we're going to do this one a little bit differently than we had originally planned, given our late time of the day. And we will go ahead in this situation and we'll go ahead and have staff do their entire presentation. And then we will do board questions and comments. We will continue to utilize the Google Doc for any next steps around this SR&R discussion. So school board members, if you can continue as we did during the last discussion to put any next steps that you have, please put them right into that Google Doc throughout the session. Let's see, Mr. Mesh, do you want to frame our discussion and get us started with our speakers?
Thank you, Ms. Tolan. So as we move into this and just framing the conversation, I want us to be mindful that the purpose of today is really taking a look from the work session we had on April 27th. Staff took a look at some of the next steps we had and our input, and are now coming with some of the revisions that they want to put in. Also keep in mind, of course, that we know that since Betsy DeVos came out with her Title IX requirements, that there's a lot of work being done on that front. But today, will be the final conversation we have, and really the final opportunity to voice any kind of disagreement about any of the text that's been attached. On the 23rd, which is our last meeting, we're going to have the opportunity to vote on the SR&R to approve it. That will be the final opportunity to change anything, and you'll have to have the amendment language live in that meeting. And of course, solicit input from our colleagues and whatnot in advance of that. So just to frame the conversation, making sure everyone's aware of the purpose and what we're doing this for. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Ms. Johnson to take away.
Thank you, Ms. Amesh. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to share additional information about the student rights and responsibilities today. I would like to start the presentation by welcoming back Dr. David Osher and Dr. Rob Mayo from the American Institutes of Research, or AIR, They have played a very large role in supporting us in the last year and last 2 years, actually, because they had conducted one of our discipline studies last year. And this year, they've been really instrumental in assisting us with reviewing our discipline practices and our policies, and specifically providing us with recommendations to the SR&R regulation and family guide to ensure that we are implementing equitable disciplinary practices. So I want to thank them again for their flexibility, as we've had several date changes for this work session, and especially for their willingness to join us at a later time today. So thank you very much, gentlemen. I also want to welcome and thank the principals who are joining us today. And I believe when I checked, we have Cindy Conley from Irving Middle School, Liz Noto from Herndon High School, Tony Copeland from Westfield High School, and Renee Miller from Keene Mill Elementary School. So we appreciate them joining us today. After the last work session, the school board had requested information about how FCPS is addressing our fidelity of implementation and consistency of discipline across the district. So today we're going to begin the work session with a brief presentation that highlights the work that's being done in the division to directly support the equitable practices. So the topics that will be covered include information about professional development, our mandatory equity and cultural responsiveness modules provided by the Office of Professional Learning and Engagement, the new tools and practices that have been developed to enhance our accountability, and changes to the proposed SR&R since the last work session. So we'll start with professional development. The goal of our division-wide professional development is to ensure that schools are aligned and consistent with discipline practices. The SR&R professional development for school administrators is created each summer, and it outlines the changes with our clear expectations for implementation. The principals associations have been great about providing us, they've actually been given a preview of the major changes to the regulation and provided input that's going to help guide our training for this coming year. This summer, a superintendent's message will be developed for teachers as part of their return to school, and it will highlight the most pertinent SR&R changes in the importance of a positive behavior approach in the classroom to support consistent school-wide expectations. A similar message was created for administrators this past August, and the principal feedback did suggest that an additional level of messaging was necessary to support the teacher understanding of our SR&R and the changes as well. So throughout the 2021 school year, training will be provided at all county principals and assistant principal meetings, and for school-based assistant principal induction program cohort. Opportunities will also be provided this coming year for systems of support advisors at the high school, deans of students, and substance abuse prevention specialists to collaborate as school-based support staff who may intervene with high school students throughout the discipline process. Additionally, training is available for region teams that support schools directly with their implementation of classroom management and positive behavior approaches. Due to the school closures and moving all of our trainings into the virtual environment, we will now have recorded professional development sessions that can be accessed on demand and referred to as new administrators are hired throughout the year and referenced for schools who might need additional support. In the past, the training was face-to-face for administrators and typically happened multiple times during the summer at need-to-know sessions. Now, this training will be available on demand and enable all new administrators and staff, or any staff, to view and review whenever necessary. New training opportunities include a training session which will be created and made available to central office support teams to ensure that SR&R changes are clearly messaged and all staff is aware of how their offices work can impact the schools they assist in the implementation of the new code of conduct. In addition, a cross-departmental training between the Office of Equity and Student Conduct, the Hearings Office, Student Safety and Wellness, Equity, Employee Relations, and the Office of Safety and Security will be developed to support best practices related to responding to student behavior and appropriate administrative interventions. Next, we're going to discuss from the Office of Equity, share information about our equity and cultural responsiveness work. And I believe we have Ms. Leona Smith here to share some of that information. Leona?
Thank you, Teresa. Can you hear me? So the Office of Professional Learning and Family Engagement and the Equity and Culture Responsive team have been supporting this work to reduce disproportionate outcomes for our students. We know that often the root cause of disproportionality is a result of cultural competencies, personal bias, whether implicit or explicit, and the need for engaging relationships and culturally relevant instruction. Therefore, yearly, the Equity and Culture Responsive team has provided equity modules that are facilitated by our equity specialists and our equity leads. The attendance at these required sessions, the attendance at these sessions are required, and there are follow-up reflections and surveys associated with them. During the 2019-20 school year, we provided 2 equity and culture competency modules. Module 4 supported instructional staff in planning and developing and implementing equitable and culturally responsive instructional practices through the design and the use of their professional learning communities. This module explored tools to help teachers in their planning to engage students in relevant and rigorous instruction. The outcomes of that professional development include exploring critical elements and conditions that foster a culturally responsive professional learning community and engage in collaborative inquiry around approaches that are responsive to the individual identities, interests, strengths, and needs of all students. In the spring of this year, right before our COVID emergency hit, we presented Module 5, in which we provided data around discipline, video exemplars, and we created and processed a tool around culturally responsive decision-making to support practices in the decision-making of staff, particularly around how we engage with students in discipline. Staff members explore the vocabulary and the concepts of identity, privilege, bias, and power, particularly how it relates to disparities in discipline and disruptive behavioral referrals. Moving forward, we had surveys collected from these professional developments, and we plan to implement the following supports to continue this in-depth dialogue and self-assessment around bias. There's an equity symposium offered to teachers and leaders next week, which will explore we'll explore racism as another root cause and bias in how we treat students. Modules 6 and 7 will be implemented this school year, which unpack and uncover bias, how to address racism, and understanding culture responsive instruction. We are working collaboratively with our partners in the Department of Special Services as they plan and implement social emotional learning modules with an equity mindset embedded in. And finally, we are integrating our student voice by creating student ambassadors to serve as equity leads at every high school as we understand more about what students experience in getting their voice on equity teams.
Great, thank you, Leona. Next, we're going to explore our systems and our school accountability tools. A new system is being developed to enhance monitoring of discipline practices at the division and the school level. Schools now have access to pull real-time data to monitor student discipline through our Student Information System, or our SIS report. Previously, data was static and made available by request and to high schools quarterly. Work templates will be designed centrally to assist with the data analysis, and a risk ratio tool will be used to assist with school improvement planning. At the state and national levels, a risk ratio equation is used to determine disproportionality ratios within student discipline. This equation compares the risk of one group to the risk of another group and is the single best measure to summarize a group's risk. Anything above a 2.0 is considered proportionate. So we want to make sure that our efforts to reduce student discipline outcomes mirrors the data points being generated at the state and national level. To align with other data tools used across the district for progress monitoring, risk ratio indexes will fall into 3 categories mirroring state and FCPS designed systems, with a green, yellow, and red, which identifies the tiered levels of support available to assist schools with disproportionate outcomes. The Office of Equity and Student Conduct will work with school administrative teams and regions to understand the risk ratio tool and build collaborative improvement plans based on the identified needs. A new online discipline referral has been developed. This fall, 16 schools will pilot the new online discipline referral in our student information system with an anticipated rollout division-wide in 2021-22. This will provide consistency in our reporting of behavior incidents to administration and give us additional data beyond the outcome data that is entered after an investigation has taken place currently. The discipline referrals will populate a discipline dashboard that will provide school teams the ability to access summary data in real time, which will then inform decision-making and targeted behavior support. Additional functionality that is part of our multi-tiered system of support data support tool will allow the division to create custom student concern referrals for academic behavior and wellness, which will be submitted to administration and support team members. This will reduce the number of disciplinary referrals being made, as there will be a systematic way to proactively address student concerns before the behavior rises to the level of needing an administrative response, and it will have a focus on intervention. The tool is being developed to provide a universal place for data collection, analysis, and action team planning to occur. This year, for additional accountability reviews, and for the first time ever, at the conclusion of the quarters, the regional assistant superintendents and executive principals, along with the regional support teams from the Office of School Support and the multi-tiered support team, engaged in data dialogues that focused on various summary data points from Department of Special Services. At the end of each dialogue, taking a team approach, region leadership committed to unified actions to ensure consistency across the division. These data reviews were eye-opening for some and will continue next year. Highlights from the quarterly data dialogues were then presented to senior leadership. We are in the process of finalizing school discipline data for the 1920 school year. Once this data is finalized, we will be sharing this detailed information with board members. Systems of support. Last year, for the first time, all schools were required to assess where they were with the implementation of the multi-tiered system of support framework focusing on the whole child. All schools will take this self-assessment for the second time this fall. The self-assessment was created to help schools evaluate the level of implementation across all three tiers for academics, behavior, and wellness. This data informs school teams about which areas they need to focus on in order to have fully implemented tiers of support across the three areas, and provides a measure of implementation progress from year to year. Centrally, the data is used to identify and inform the professional development, the resources, and the coaching that's needed to support schools by region. The central office MTSS team continues to support schools with implementation of academics, behavior, and wellness through school-based and system-level coaching, as well as providing tailored Tier 1 behavior training for the implementation of a robust positive behavior approach. Targeted school-based coaching is provided to site intervention teams, collaborative teams, administrators, and individual teachers to improve the data, the systems, and the practices used to implement MTSS. The system-level coaching provides opportunities for other schools to collaborate together, to explore key practices for MTSS implementation across the tiers, and to problem solve and with colleagues in sessions facilitated by district coaches. So next we're going to review the recommendations that were provided to us during or after the last work session, and we'll also review a change required by the federal government. After our April presentation, the United States Department of Education Title IX regulation was released, which resulted in the removal of the following offenses from the SR&R: sexual harassment, sexual assault, and stalking. These offenses will now be addressed under a new FCPS Title IX regulation in development. Revisions to the SR&R include updates to relevant footnotes, updates to relevant codes, clarifying that issues about discrimination, including complaints about sexual harassment or gender-based discrimination, are to be presented to the Title IX coordinator, and clarifying that for the purposes of the SR&R, discriminatory harassment will not include discrimination based on sex, gender identity, or sexual orientation. Such discrimination will be addressed under the Title IX regulation. School board members also provided several recommendations related to language changes. These recommended language changes were also reviewed by the Equity Office and principal groups. You'll see on this slide in teal recommended changes to the proposed dress code language that addresses the follow-up comments to our presentation. This includes removing the language sagging or low-cut pants and adding clothing that exposes undergarments. Other language changes clarify the reference to head coverings, hats as an example, and the requirement for the family to contact the school for head covering accommodation has been removed, instead adding that school administration may reach out to the family if clarification is needed regarding the purpose of the head covering. And lastly, to be more inclusive, the term ethnic has been replaced with the word cultural. An additional suggested clarification emphasizes that a case manager is the preferred IEP team member to consult with when making disciplinary decisions. The other team members would be sufficient if the case manager was not available. So this ends the formal part of our presentation. The recommendation is to vote to approve Regulation 2601 with the proposed changes, and this action is scheduled for July 23rd. You'll also note on this slide the current timeline for implementation of a number of the changes to the reg due to our Virginia and federal regulatory changes. Just to keep in mind, this is one of the only regulations reviewed by the school board annually. And because of this late date, we will begin revisions to next year's policy and regulation in just a few months. We typically begin that in the fall. So with that, I will hand it back over to Ms. Omesh and Ms. Tolan.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And thank you to the team for putting this together. For the benefit of the board, I know we have Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo here as well. I will start off by apologizing for the delay, and thank you guys so much for your patience with our timing here. So we'll go ahead and hear from our board members. Each board member will have 2 minutes to speak. We'll start with Ms. Karen Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I have two questions, or a couple of questions and then a request. My questions are, or a statement. I love the mandatory equity and cultural responsiveness training. I think that's great. I would like to see our SR&R training, which is going to be online, also mandatory, and would like to see the enhanced data monitoring tool if the school board members could have access to it. And then finally, I would love to hear from Dr. Osher about, you guys did a fantastic discipline study at the request of the board and presented it last year, which drove a lot of our changes in the SR&R. If you could do a status update of, the changes that we made in response to your study last year and what's still outstanding, that would be fantastic. Then my last and probably the most important question regarding the actual regulation is I would like to understand why we have language in here on page 40 of the new SR&R about discretionary reporting to law enforcement. If it's discretionary, why are we doing that?
Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. And I apologize if I wasn't clear that the SR&R training is mandatory for all administrators, and it will be viewed by all the teacher staff. So thank you for that. I do believe we should be able to have the opportunity to share the data monitoring systems once everything is up and running, and I'll defer to Carrie Williams with additional information about that. And before we hear from Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo, maybe Carrie could address that discretionary language reporting. I believe that had something to do with the change in the state code. Carrie?
Sure, thank you. As far as the discipline data tool, once we have developed all of our end of year data summary and analysis, we will put that into a summary format for you and share with the board. So we're working on that. I anticipate on having something later this week. And I want to make sure I give you some context around the data that you'll be reviewing, and Dr. Brabrand will have more information on that as soon as we have that complete. As far as the language on page 40 about mandatory versus discretionary reporting, previously this is based upon state code that came into place on July 1st. The previous list of infractions that you see there were mandatory, but now they are only mandatory if they rise to the level of a felony. And then if those similar behaviors, if they are a misdemeanor, those misdemeanor behaviors are able to be reported by the principal's discretion. So when working with our legal team to make sure that we had language that covered the state legislative changes, we put in what was mandatory and what was then at the discretion of the principal.
So along those lines, I'm going to make a recommendation that we're very careful with this discretionary reporting, and that there is some sort of check and balance put in, and that it is not just an automatic discretionary reporting, but that it either has to go to the RAS or to the superintendent prior to it being reported to the police department.
Thank you for that feedback. And Dr. Osher or Dr. Mayo, would you like to share some information?
Sure. David, would you like to speak first?
Yeah, is my mic on?
Yes, it is.
All right. I will speak for a minute and then I'll pass it on to Dr. Mayo. I think that, and we did together go over and looked at every one of the recommendations deliberately. The point I would like to make is, in addition to what you'll hear from Dr. Mayo, that I think the spirit of the recommendations has been realized. I mean, I'll just call out the, in hearing the updates, the importance of student voice, the trainings, and I think the mandatory nature of them, the fact that they are including issues like racism and privilege, I think are very, very important. The use of risk ratios, which I think will be very, very key, as you've heard, and the targeted professional, consultation, I think all of which are very, very important and very much in the spirit of what we've talked about, what we called out in our report. I'm now going to pass it on to Dr. Mayo, who has the records of our vetting of where we are. So, Rob?
Thank you, David. And thank you for this opportunity today. I apologize. For some reason, my computer is not allowing me to share my video today. As we spoke on the topic before, this was a very rewarding experience to have the hard work and collaborative work that was put in over the last 2 years, acted upon in a very intentional and authentic way, both with the policy updates and as well as the planning and ongoing hard work that's being put in around prevention and integration of prevention and interventions integration and the work around multi-tier systems of supports, the intentional focus on capacity building and expanding and deepening the opportunities for professional development, improving the data systems. It was great to see the quarterly meetings and monthly checks, accountability, and I would like to call them accountability and support discussions that will continue to be held and had, knowing that this is very, very difficult work, and just with that focus on supporting site level educators, and nothing that I've heard or read comes across as a gotcha. And I certainly hope that your educators feel that way as well. We talked a bit, David and I did our crosswalk or reviewed the crosswalk just to focus on, again, what was mentioned earlier around really sending the right message to educators and most importantly, perhaps students and families, and approaching all this from an assets or strengths-based disposition, if you will, as opposed to deficit model. And that takes work and changing some adult mindsets and ways of being and interacting with kids takes time, and I think that a lot of the things that have been in place and are in the works based on my recent conversations with Carrie are definitely heading in the right direction and continue to head in the right direction. Likewise, going back to support and accountability checks, again, given the autonomy, which is a wonderful thing, or can be a wonderful thing, the devil, so to speak, will be in the details around what happens when you have high flyers, if you will, based on clean, available data through these incremental checks and reporting, how you go about balancing the autonomy and support, accountability and support in light of the autonomy when the data tell you that despite the efforts that are currently going on, it's not working for certain groups of kids, or certain pyramids or schools within pyramids continue to struggle in these areas how do you go about balancing, again, the autonomy and accountability piece, and how do you go about monitoring the fidelity and supporting the fidelity of the selected multi-tier systems of supports, preventions and interventions, and the related programming. So that's always a fine line to walk, and I'm sure that you all will figure that out. But I just want to put that out there because it can be very, very difficult at times. But it always has to be a goal. And the only other thing that really, really comes to mind is continue to deepen and expand the collaboration with the Family Engagement Office. We know that there are communities and families within communities that don't have the same level of agency or don't feel like they have the same level of agency when it comes to discipline-related processing and appeals and things of that nature. So continue to build their capacity, and not, in an adversarial way, obviously, but in a collaborative way, an authentically collaborative way, and continue to likewise tap into youth voice. Because the ultimate goal, as we would probably agree, is for it to be our expectations of one another, not expectations being administered or in a top-down sort of way from the district to the site level leadership, and from the site level leadership to families, communities, and kids. So just keeping, again, that more collaborative and progressive, if you will, approach to this work will really continue to set the stage for the continued progress. And it's been a true pleasure.
If it's appropriate, may I take one more minute as well?
Please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm in full agreement with Dr. Mayo's gratitude and our respect for the direction that we're going. As somebody whose research work, as well as practice experience, suggests to me that both we want to ultimately be able to eliminate all disparate suspensions, that I think in the end the issue is both the fidelity of implementation of supports, but also when we find places where we have problems or groups who are seeming to have problems, to figure out what are the other things that are necessary to succeed. We know from schools across the country that it is possible in the most challenging settings. It just means you have to elevate the level of support and or engagement. And I think it's probably even more engagement. And so I think we have both questions of the quality of what is being done, but also the richness, the robustness, the intensity with which things are doing, and the fact that it may very well be in some places you have to be even more culturally responsive and culturally sustaining. It may be in some places you have to be even more trauma sensitive if you're going to be able to succeed. It may be that some school communities need to much more deeply confront issues of how bias and mindset affects adult behavior. And so what I would say is that the spirit is here, and I would not have expected anything more right now. At the same time, I think it's important to know that this is not just about a checklist of doing things well, which I know is not what Dr. Mayo meant, but also using one's planning and the data and student and adult voice to make sense so that one could actually get to the point that one can eliminate suspension. And just so that you don't think I'm just talking smoke from my own values, I mentioned when we met with the board last year that we were doing a major study in a big city. The city was New York City. We were able to look at every two suspended over a 10-year period and look at the longitudinal impacts on their experience over the course of their life in education, as well as the impacts on peers and teachers on the year that the students were first suspended. And we through that work really saw significant effects both in the decision to suspend or not, and in terms of dosage on issues like attendance and graduation.
Thank you. So we'll hear from.
Can you send us that study?
I'll be happy to. It is, I mean, New York City has let us do that. That it is a deck. It's sort of a mid-level of comprehensible. I mean, it was done for lay people, but to go over how we use machine learning to do this work. So I'll be happy to do it. And then if people would like to give them a greater sense of how we make sense of it. And please also know that we're doing continued analyses right now to further look at issues of disparities in terms of issues of race and intersectional identities, as well as on the relationship between climate as students perceive it and what we saw in what was happening. But I will be happy to share it.
Thank you. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Great, thank you. First, thank you for your work. Thank you, Ms. Johnson and your team for this great work on the changes to the SRNR. I really like the charts you have at the beginning. So I just want to start with saying I recognize your hard work and good work here. So my comments are just to add a little bit. I know I've talked to you and Ms. Lewis about our cultural competency work, and I'm excited to continue our conversations around that. But I would like to sort of say here in this moment that while I think it's great that we're requiring the equity modules, I really do think, given that our discipline disparities are the greatest for students with disabilities, even more than students of color, that we add a neurodiversity model to our equity work so we can make sure that the cultural competency includes neurodiversity and the lived norms of people with disabilities. And I just wanted to put that out there. In the same vein, I am concerned in our SRNRs that our IEP teams are really only getting involved if there's a written statement from our students, as opposed to any questioning. As anyone who's worked with several kids with disabilities know, understanding questions and really processing it well enough to answer sometimes can be difficult. There's a lot of tendency to want to please, to say yes. And so I really think that we need to have case managers or other trusted IEP team members involved, especially when we're looking at our kids in our self-contained classes, to make sure that they're not accidentally saying things, and especially in interactions with SROs, because we do know how dangerous that can be for students with disabilities if we don't have the proper safeguards. I'm also concerned that our social media policy, I think there should be some room to update it to reflect our virtual learning environment. So it's not just social media, but really digital citizenship and a broader lens to that. And then I'd like to see also our IEP teams involved anytime there's discipline, not just an MDR when it's out of school. Thank you.
Thank you.
If someone could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
I think your idea about neurodiversity model and adding that to our cultural competency work is a great idea. You and I have talked about this before, and I support that. Our IEP teams, thank you for your comment about that. I do believe that there's some tighter language around statements from students that are ID or developmentally disabled. So we will take a look at that again. And your social media policy, we will really have to take a look at that. And I don't know if Carrie wants to add anything beyond social media other than our acceptable user policy, which is a little more in depth. But I don't know, Carrie, do you have anything to add about social media?
Yes, the AUP does cover, the acceptable use policy does cover more than just social media. It does dig into digital citizenship, and it is also covered in the SRNR video. There's now going to be a video for elementary school that will be shown to third grades 3 through 6, and then there's a secondary video for 7 through 12. So that includes digital citizenship as well as some of the language in our quick guides that go home with the students. And it is also in the family guide in the front half of the book as well. And I have expanded the language to include both the physical classroom as well as the virtual space in any of the support documents and the video that goes along with the SRNR.
Thank you. And then just the SRO interaction and IEP team support.
So I guess we need to dig into maybe talk offline a little bit about that. You know, should not be involved in any school discipline at this point. So if there is something specific you want to discuss, then I'm happy to have other conversations with the administrators as a whole.
Sounds
All
good.
And I would also
ahead.
I'd also like to add, in terms of SRO, our team also did provide 4 hours of professional development this year to our SROs, to include 2 hours of culture proficiency as well as 2 hours of bias from a school perspective developmentally. I know there's probably more we can do, but that was a first start as well.
All right, Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Yes, thank you. I'll start by saying, Teresa, you mentioned that the SROs shouldn't be involved, and I know there is a section here referencing SROs, and I'm actually going to focus on that and then write my other comments. It starts on page 41, but before I say that, I do appreciate the cultural competency module that's been mentioned here, and I would love for our school board to have access to that. It would be great to see that. I think one of the experts made a comment about it's really about the climate and how, you know, students perceive that. And so a lot of my comments with respect to the document that starts actually on page 35, but I'll be focusing primarily on page 41 and further on, because I think in this climate, we have to recognize that not everyone sees an SRO in our schools as, you know, a neutral thing, right? Like there is in some of our communities real fear regarding police officers. And so I think that we did a lot of work in the last year or so to try to put some boundaries in place. The concerns that I'm getting from the community is that is not always followed. So some of the language that I would like to kind of tease out a little bit begins on page 41, where it talks about their SROs are an integral part of the school community. I think that we may need to do some work to make sure that everyone actually agrees with that, and to recognize how different people see SROs. Then further down that page, it talks about how they can get involved when there is a concern that is identified. There's language throughout this that is a bit more subjective than I would like for it to be, and I will write some of those out, but one of them is on page 41. Oh my God. Would you like for me to do a go back, or how would you like for me to handle that, Ms. Meeting Manager?
So time is up. Depending on where we are, we had not planned go backs, but we'll hear what staff has to offer.
I will just I will wrap this up with this comment. I will just respectfully say that this is a really important topic, and we don't get really much of a chance as a board to discuss this, and we have to approve it soon. So I would like for us to identify a vehicle by which we can communicate our concerns.
The Google Doc for next steps is available. Everyone is welcome to put in place, you know, what questions they would like to be resolved, and staff will respond to those. So staff will go ahead.
I'd like to consider back. Thank you.
I can share regarding the modules. We would love to have opportunity to engage with the school board and some professional learning together. We would love to actually implement modules 4 and 5 when you have time. We know that these meetings are so full, and we know that your time is precious as you answer all the needs of all your constituents. We would love to find some time to share those with you. So we will work with your clerical staff to see if there's an opportunity for us to do that.
So in addition to that, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, thank you for your comments about climate. I could not agree more, and I know our team could not agree more. We would certainly be interested to know if there are, you know, within the scope of the responsibilities in the SR&R, the limitations, as well as the SRO. We could certainly engage with Office of Security and Mr. Vaccarello if there are additional concerns, because specific concerns, I believe, pretty strongly need to be followed up on. But we look forward to hearing whatever other language recommendations you make to the SR&R in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Next, we'll have Ms. McLaughlin.
Yes, thank you. To the public, I apologize. I was at the vet earlier today, so I'm not dressed as professionally as I would prefer to be. But I did want to have a video for these remarks. First of all, I want to thank staff. I tend to be pretty intense about where I'd like to see continuous improvement. And so I really want to start with praise. Ms. Johnson, for your team, Dr. Braybrand, for your leadership. This is a long way coming as someone who has been championing discipline reform for more than 10 years prior to even joining the board. So I'm very excited about this. I'm excited about how much we're building in the use of data. Everything comes down to data. And gosh, more than 7-8 years ago, as a new board member, I was asking for quarterly reports on this type of data so that we could monitor and see how discipline was occurring across all of our schools. So this is incredibly welcomed news. I also want to follow up on something that Ms. Keys-Gamarra was saying about our SROs. I know we did not build in time today to talk about it, but that is something that I've also been raising for multiple years now, in how we as a school system work with the county on our priorities. So as we know right now, facing a COVID pandemic, we do not have enough school nurses in our school buildings, and particularly our large buildings like middle schools and high schools. And yet the county has had the funding to put police officers into our schools. I know that our police officers, the SROs in particular, many of them care about their relationships with kids. But I think it is long past due that we need to look at our SRO data to determine as a county where we need them specifically in schools and where we need to just make sure that they are proximate to schools. But we certainly know we need school nurses in our buildings now in this time. So Ms. Keys-Gamarra, thank you for teeing up my position.
All right. Is there anything staff would like to address?
Thank you.
Ms. Amish, I would actually like to have the experts. Could I make sure that after Dr. Braybrand's break, please have the experts weigh in on what they know to having SROs specifically in schools from a discipline prevention. Thank you.
Just real quickly, Ms. McLaughlin, thank you so much for those comments. Look, you know, we always want to have an environment where we can offer room for improvement, but also acknowledge outstanding work. And I can't tell you how proud I am of Teresa and Leona and Carrie. They've just done amazing work here. This SR&R is a long way from where it was years ago. We are finally going to have real-time discipline data in a way that even Dr. Domenech talked about 20 years ago when he had 10 targets and target 9 was school suspensions. And we didn't have the data systems then, and we're creating it now 20 years later. So I really appreciate your comments. I look forward to continued work on this. And you are going to see this work is going to have results as we keep pushing an equity focus, including around our school discipline issues. So thank you so much for sharing your comments this afternoon. And now I'll let the experts share.
Okay, so this is David Osher. First of all, I want to, in this case, call out Dr. Braybrand as well, because I think this board has got you to this place, and at the same time, I think you need leadership that has been willing with his or her staff to move in this direction. The overall evidence on schools is that they do not actually have a demonstrable effect. That being the case, and I should say a demonstrable positive effect. And in some cases, if they're not appropriately used, they can have a negative effect. And I also do think, as Ms. McLaughlin had suggested if there is a finite amount of resources, how you best deploy the resources is an issue that if one had equal access to subsidy, one might very well want to put money into a school nurse, which is often necessary, perhaps now particularly necessary, and or some additional health support, et cetera, et cetera. That's the empirical data. At the same time, what I think we have nationally is the fact that both there are many young people, particularly young people of color, who may experience SROs in the ways that Ms. Keys, pardon me for my pronunciation, Gamera, had talked about, and at the same time, there may very well be other young people, including some young people of color, who feel more comfortable when there is an SRO present. And then there's thirdly, let me add one other thing, which is if one were going in a direction where one tried to figure out where you would want SROs to be, I think it's also important to know that if we look at the national data relative to what is experienced by young people of color and what is experienced by young people who face economically disadvantage, they are much more likely to be attending schools that are militarized, that have high police presence, whether police outside of the school and or SROs. And so the one thing that I would advise, knowing that, is that if you do go a route relative to school nurses and have that possibility, that it's important to make sure that there is equal access to it, that it is not that some places have school nurses and other places have SROs. I know that's not what you meant, but I think that there could be a risk if one saw that one had a finite pot of money and was distributing it in a particular way.
Thank you, Doctor. I think you actually captured that well.
Thank you, Dr. Osher. And I remind my colleagues, folks, that this specific conversation, while of course related, is not to address the SRO point in particular. Of course, there's a memorandum of understanding, which I know is going to be in the agenda coming up. But just reminding everyone how we framed this early on to stay focused. Ms. Marin.
Yes, thank you. I'm really thrilled to have our experts with us today. So although I've read this many times and I reviewed it this weekend, I really read it with my parent hat on. And for that reason, I had many questions about just how clearly the information reads in terms of clearly stating a student's rights and their responsibilities, and us laying out what we expect of our young students. And then the acts of getting into trouble and not trying to stay out of that, and then the consequences. And I liked that there were the attached flow charts. I thought that that was really helpful. And I wonder if there could even be something like that so that there's a visual for parents to understand all this information. There was also an equity and discipline document that I somehow received that wasn't included in this. And I'm just wondering if that, again, is another kind of flow chart we want to include. I like that Dr. Mayo referenced that youth voice, and Ms. Sizemore-Heiser mentioned the neurodiversity piece, and I'm glad to see the language we're using, cultural competency, and that's great that we're changing our documents to be modernized and respectful in this way. I'm really pleased to see it. I agree that some of the topics like social media or digital citizenship, that they must be updated for this time during COVID especially, and particularly, does there need to be like some kind of special COVID insert that perhaps addresses things that could only be imagined during this time? But if anything, definitely the social media piece. I did send staff extensive comments last night for their consideration, but thank you for this work. It's really exciting to see the changes happening.
So Ms. Omesh, if I could just comment briefly,
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Marin, for your comments. We did get your very extensive email, and it would take some time to get through all of that. Those charts, most of the charts are actually in the parent section in the family guide. We had support from Dr. Mayo in drafting those, so we appreciated that. The equity document that you sent us a copy of was actually our equity and discipline. It came out of the studies last year, and that was included as a link in our last work session in April. That can certainly be sent out again for those who'd like to take a look at it. And certainly appreciate your comments about the social media and the digital citizen. If you have some additional information or language you'd like us to add, please send that on.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just say I'm glad that you mentioned the family engagement piece, because as we also are trying to update that family engagement policy, I think this really goes hand in hand. And that, again, that same lens of being, culturally aware and speaking to parents in a way that they can access the information. So thank you, Teresa. Ms. Johnson.
All right, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much. To reiterate what all of my colleagues shared, thank you for all of this great work. It is much appreciated. I would be remiss if I didn't at least quickly touch upon what Ms. Keys-Gamarra shared regarding the SRO climate in various schools with various groups and communities. I think that's important for us to have a broader discussion at the right time regarding that. It's really essential that we unpack those practices and actions that have led to those disparities and expectations, and also in how they are perceived in various communities. One of my questions is regarding the page 7 of the chart, the mandatory equity and cultural responsiveness training. I'm very much appreciative of this. One of the things that I would love to hear more about are regarding the objectives of this training for staff. I know that they exist, but I'm curious in terms of what metrics are being utilized to target whether or not those objectives are being met. What data will be collected to inform this work, to see, are we hitting what we want to do with our staff? So I'll stop there and have Ms. Johnson respond.
So I'm going to ask Ms. Smith to respond, Leona.
Sure, I can respond. So at the end of each of the professional development, there are surveys around changes in practices. And I think when you think about equity work, though, it really comes out in the data. And so we need to be moving forward. We still need work to be done around the quarterly reviews of discipline data. That's where that work should show up. When we look at gaps in our instructional practices, that's where that work should show up. One of the conversations we were having recently is about how prominent our equity profile is and how it's not prominent enough. It's pretty hidden on our website. You have to know to search for it. You have to know it exists. And so we want to make sure that we're moving that to a more prominent place to be transparent in our data, because that's where this work will show up. And then finally, we shared with the board, not this board, it was in last fall, sort of our equity self-assessment tool. And so our goal this year is to move that equity self-assessment tool, and that all schools will have to engage with that self-assessment tool and create goals around that as another way of measuring our equity success. We know, I thank the experts for sharing that takes hard work to change people's hearts and minds, but what we can do is monitor where it shows up in our classrooms with our children. And so I think those are the actions. It's the professional development survey feedback, moving our equity profile to more prominent location, and also requiring schools to participate in the equity self-assessment. The Virginia Department of Education is also creating a new equity framework that is supposed to be released in August. And they have tools in which they are creating that they plan to share with all of the directors, such as myself, that include equity audits, as well as the last thing that sort of connects to one of you mentioned before, which I appreciate. Thank you so much, bringing back up the family engagement policy and the connections between that. We are also thinking of how we use our welcoming walkthroughs as data points as well, to know that our equity work is working. And so those are all in the works as we speak around, as we move this work forward. Thank you.
Thank you. My second question is regarding the enhanced professional development that is outlined on slide 5. In respect to restorative justice training, the benefits are clear to our students and our schools, but I am concerned when feedback is received that access to that training is limited. I'm curious as to whether or not we'll have opportunity to also have those trainings be on demand for our schools as well.
I'm going to ask Ms. Carrie Williams to weigh in. Carrie or Deb?
So I believe that with all of our trainings going, our large-scale trainings going virtual next year, that Stefan Maskell and the restorative justice team are certainly planning on having their sessions provided in a virtual format that can be recorded, which should allow some increased flexibility with staff being able to receive that. We also know that they have modified their approach, and last year was cut short, unfortunately, where they had changed their training model so that they could have more access for more individuals. And I believe they tripled the access last year. So we can certainly check with Mr. Maskell and get back with you on that.
I would appreciate that. Thank you. And my last is just a comment supporting what Ms. Marin shared regarding an addendum for all of the behaviors and all of the actions that we are expecting in now our virtual environment that possibly half of our students will engage in. I'm curious to see how some of that will be embedded into this document so that we have an opportunity to address concerns that may arise. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Cohen.
Thanks again. I really do appreciate it. I think it's amazing to me to look back at, I'm now about to be the parent of a 10th grader, and to think of how the SRNR has changed and evolved over these last near 11 years of us receiving it. I think it's some of the best work that we have done to this point in figuring out a better system where we are not in the role of punishing our students. We are trying to redirect and educate our students and our staff about how to make better choices. And I think that's where we need to be as a system. To that end, there's a couple of concerns that I had that I hope you might be able to address. In the discretionary reporting piece, I just want to be sure that we're keeping track of demographics, and that included in those demographics are not just race and ethnicity, that it's also SPED, it's also FRM, because we do know that we see, even though I think we have amazing principals, there are folks who use their discretion quite differently sometimes than others do. And it's really important for us to keep that data and hopefully be able to do some of that education piece in helping them make better choices. The second for me is in attending a lot of town halls and the conversations that we've begun to really have around race in our system, I want to be sure that there are some very clear guidelines and specifics for the use of racial slurs in our schools. Our principals, at least here in the Springfield district, have reached out to me that they would be very appreciative of some very clear guidance about consequences and what we really want to do to tackle, in particular, repeated offenses.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. Ms. Johnson?
So thank you, Ms. Cohen. For the discretionary reporting, and Carrie could weigh in here, I believe the dashboard is going to share a good deal of that information. That's once that data and that tool is up and running. So I'm very hopeful about that. And we can certainly take a look if there are language recommendations about beefing up certain sections, then please let us know what you advise. Thank you.
Hi, so I can add on to that. We will certainly take a look at how we can break down the police reporting that's not currently in the quarterly data dialogues that we did. If I can't make that happen by this week when we pull the rest of the data, we will certainly look into that for you. And there is a code specifically that addresses racial slurs, and it's outlined in one of the behavior categories with the levels of consequences that are also then outlined and supported in the chart. So if there is additional language or suggestions you have, we'd be happy to hear about those.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Great. Mr. Frisch. We can't hear you, Mr. Frisch.
Better? I'm going to do that every meeting. I promise I'll get it eventually. I think there could be a general sense that there's a lack of urgency around these issues sometimes. I think that's what Mrs. Keys-Gamarra was speaking to when she said that we needed a thorough conversation on this matter. And that's not to say that this board should not endeavor to have meetings that are mindful of the unique time constraints of our members or the public who might be watching a 5 or 6 hour meeting. But that we can do a better job of planning and budgeting our time so that we can have thoughtful consideration on these issues. With that said, I have some questions about professional development and our ability to adjust as needed. I think the fact that we have what is essentially, or will have what is essentially real-time reporting through the dashboard with the quarterly and monthly discipline data reviews will give us a good idea as to whether or not these changes that we're putting in place, this additional professional development, is having an impact. How do you see the school division's ability to change based on the data that we're receiving? If we don't see a shift in data based on these changes, what do we do?
That's an excellent question. I think Carrie has been, as long as she's been with us, and I constantly thank the board for her position, because having a dedicated person to actually be committed to the data and the reporting of it and developing that professional development has made a difference. And Carrie, you can report out about how you've been looking at the data and it's already, you're seeing improvements.
We've seen some overall improvements from last year through March when we looked at the numbers through this year. Certainly at the semester data review, we were certainly trending in the right direction. But I think it really boils down to having specific school level data that we can share with the principals, and then we can go in and we can work with the teams to develop a plan that supports their specific team, the school, and the community. So I'm looking forward to sharing the risk ratio data with the school principals, and then moving toward developing some of those individual plans. Last year, we really focused on our data collection mechanisms. And when we have the full district rollout for the teacher behavior referral, we'll not only be able to look at our outcomes from the administrative investigation and the supports or the sanctions that were implemented after the investigation, but we'll know what our teacher level referral data looks like, so we can even go down to the micro level of which classroom needs individualized support for discipline, and we'll be able to look at that centrally. So I'm very excited about all of those new tools that we're putting into place, and we're certainly going to start those conversations with the 16 schools as we pilot this year, and then we'll be able to look at that across the division next year.
And Carrie, I would like, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, sorry. No, it's fine. I'm sorry.
I would add that in addition to the work that Carrie's doing, the Equity and College Responsive team does have specialists that collaborate with Carrie, as well as with principals. So, you know, when we're looking at the data, we know that sometimes that is reactive data, and that's where the professional development comes in as proactive. How are we helping teachers understand how their bias is in the way of often of relationships and the way in which they treat students? So oftentimes, the 5 equity specialists that are assigned per region spend a lot of time coaching principals, providing professional development at the school level. And so we're able to respond in that way as well. So not only do we do the modules, we respond directly and differentiate by school as well.
I'll just end with this. On Laura Jane's comment about racial slurs, one of the things that I learned going to a bunch of the GSA clubs around Fairfax County was that there are a number of queer kids who do not report incidents of hate speech or being dead named, whatever, because these incidents happen in front of adults and nothing happens. One of the good byproducts of the conversation around Black Lives Matter is that you have many young people who are not staying silent anymore. How do we change the culture of silence around a lot of this? You know, it's one thing to say that we have less reporting of X, Y, or Z, but if these incidents are still happening and they're just not being reported, how do we change that culture aside from just the SRNR adjustments?
Thank you.
So, Carl, I have, Mr. Frisch, one comment about that. Being a former high school principal and the principals that are on here, I believe very strongly that is related to the culture and the climate in the building and how administrators respond to children in the building and engage and embrace our children and the comments that they have to say, and trusting in the fact that oftentimes kids know and say, and it's not about just assuming that the adult is correct. So in my opinion, and any principal can weigh in, it's very much about how you build the climate in your building. And that's work that we continue to need to do. And the multi-tiered system of support work that focuses on the whole child is instrumental in helping us make that happen.
And I would add to that, that getting student voice involved is critical. So the student ambassadors, the town halls we've been having, when people see other people share their stories, they feel empowered to share theirs as well. And we have not done enough of that as a division to listen to our children. They will tell us what we need to do. And so recently, I felt very empowered and inspired by listening to our youth. So having additional town halls is on our list of things that we want to do for students this year, and using those student ambassadors to help lead those conversations and be part of equity teams so that other students can lead by example. Students don't speak up because they think no one is listening. And we need to create cultures in which we show that we are authentically listening. And so I agree with Ms. Johnson's point. That comes down to the culture in the building. I have a high school student myself, and she wants to know that she feels heard, and that if she says something, something will happen. And so that is our commitment, is moving to student voice. We need to listen to our children. So your point is very well received and hits me right in my heart that we show up every day for our kids and we need to listen to them. They will tell us what they need.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. So before our next section of this meeting, I do want to go to Ms. Tolan. Offer your remarks.
Thank you. The nice part about coming at the end is I don't have to repeat some of the nice remarks that my colleagues have made around COVID and SROs, which I definitely agree with. But I do want to applaud. I was so excited to see in the presentation the increase in the data tools to really look at, are we getting the bang for our buck, if you will, with the investments that we're making. I noticed that, you're looking at quarterly reporting, and I would like to ask that, the school board get a quarterly report, with some analysis around, how successful we're being or not successful, or as Mr. Frisch was saying, what are some recommendations for making changes if we're not as successful as we think we should be. I'm super excited about, of course, our strength-based approach and how we're increasing that, and really, really appreciated Leona Smith's recent comments on student voice and really listening to student voice and figuring out how we can hear from our students, what it is that can help them, be more successful and avoid some of these disciplinary issues. So thank you so much for all your work on this. I'm really excited to see how these changes will have a positive impact.
Great. I won't take up too much time. I know a lot of this work I've been doing behind the scenes, meeting with many of you guys several times. Obviously, the hope is to move us towards, over time, a model where we're raising our children, right, where these are learning opportunities. And I would just make a point of advocacy to my colleagues that this requires us to look at support procedures, staffing, whether, socio-emotional kind of staff, to be able to lower those ratios to do this more effectively. So I just want to make sure we're thinking about the multiple systems at play for us to achieve our goals that we're all verbalizing, even within the SRNR. So with that, I know there are some burning go backs. I'm going to ask us to be judicious. Reminder, again, this is specifically preparing us for the meeting on the 23rd. We have the opportunity from now until then, if we want to present any amendments and collect consensus from our colleagues, but we will limit to 1 minute if anyone has a burning go back for that purpose. All right, again, for the purpose of the SRNR approval. Ms. Karen Keys-Gamarra.
Yes, thank you. Let me just clarify. The language is in the regulation, and that is something that would go along with the SRNR, and it's part of the presentation that we're dealing with. And that's the reason I feel like it's important that I raise these concerns right now. So I was actually just typing out some of it. On page 30, for example, there of the reg, there is up to a 10-day suspension for the use of a personally owned device. I think we need greater clarity there. I can write some of these things out. There's also within the regulation, it talks about a kindergarten to third grade student can be suspended for up to, I believe, up to 10 days if he is determined to have violated the SRNR with aggravating circumstances. I have no idea what that means. There's another section a little further down that says that a kindergarten through third grade student can be suspended after receiving an explanation from the administrator. Again, I think the parent should be involved.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. If staff want to say anything about that.
No, I don't have any comment at this time.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Yes, just a couple of quick things. One, at the very beginning, we've deleted language regarding the ability of teachers may assist the student and parent in identifying missed work for unexcused absences. I'd like to understand why we took that out. And then additionally, going back to the discretionary reporting, I'm just letting my school board colleagues know that I will be putting forth an amendment on this one because I have serious concerns with how it's written. And then last, in the discussion of SROs, if I remember correctly, the MOU does have language about parent notification when an SRO is involved. And so if we could please get clarification as to why we don't have parent notification in that section. Or maybe I'm just missing it.
Ms. Johnson?
Yeah, Carrie, I'm going to ask you to weigh in here. I'm not sure about why the missed work piece was taken out.
We wanted the missed work to be more of an expectation that all students had access to make up all work, and that it did not need to be that the teacher would specifically identify for one particular student that they needed or could make up this, that the expectation is generally that all students are able to make up all work and to have it graded while they are on suspension. You know, if that's a clarification that you think needs to remain in there, I think that's something we could certainly take a look at. As far as I would have to go back and I'd have to reread the section in depth about the parent notifications in relationship to the SRO.
Okay, if you could get back to me on that, that'd be great. And on the, I do think we have to have an affirmative on makeup work.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Corbett Sanders. So with that, we're going to review next steps, everybody. If everyone can take a look at our Google Doc, please. I'm going to just suggest off the bat, whoever wrote number 5, please take a look and revise that or add your name to it. Otherwise, I'm going to erase it. It doesn't have anyone's name. And as we're taking a look, if any board member has any objections to these, or if staff want to weigh in on the feasibility or the relevance of any of these, please raise your hand. Dr. Rebrand?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Omesh. I would just share, as we said before, you know, staff will be glad to look at these. If we have a major concern, that would be part of our response. But I know board members have been at it 7 or 8 hours. A couple of folks, you know, have other engagements. Staff will look at it. We'll do our due diligence. And if we have a real concern, we'll certainly share it with the board leadership and then the whole board and figure it out. But I don't feel compelled to go through every one from our staff perspective. We're here to serve the board and work on your next steps, and we'll do so.
Thank you, Dr. Rebrand. Anyone else want to comment on any of these before we approve them without objection? Okay, as I said, I will be removing number 5 since nobody has added their name, nor is it a complete sentence. Or thought, I mean. Okay, so with that, we will be wrapping up our work session. I do want to just say, first of all, thank you to everyone for your patience. I think, as we reflect, and Elaine, feel free to jump in here as to how, we tried different things today. I think certainly we want to make sure that as we schedule our meetings to begin with, that we allot appropriate amounts of time, because to everyone's points, there are extremely important conversations we're having and questions that are being raised. Like everyone else, I think it's important for us to continue these conversations offline as well, but no doubt to have them here. And, I think an hour and a half, for example, for the distance learning presentation to begin with was not enough at all, right? So that's something for us to take away as we plan to make sure none of us feel suppressed or that we don't have the room to speak. Elaine, did you want to jump in and say anything?
I would just say I certainly appreciate the flexibility of our colleagues, and to the public as well. We are just trying to experiment a little bit with some different methods to try to make these meetings go more smoothly and be a little bit more timely, because we know that so many times you're left waiting and waiting and waiting, for different topics to come up. So anyway, we certainly appreciate your patience with us today. With that, we don't want people to leave at this point. We want to take a couple of minutes. I'll turn it over to Abrar here in a second, but we have a staff member with us today that gave her last presentation to the school board before her retirement. And this is a huge step for Teresa Johnson. So we just wanted to take a couple minutes to acknowledge that. And we have a little fun surprise. So Abrar, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, the surprise speaks for itself. We tried to compile some gratitude, and we'll certainly share this file with you. But Eileen can go ahead and post it, and with that, other than that, we're finished our business today, so we can adjourn. But please, Eileen, post it so folks can take a moment to appreciate Teresa as she exits. It's hard to view, and I think there's sound as well, but
Teresa, that's almost as good as a gold watch.
Or the clock I got. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Zoom in to see what it says. But
Congratulations, Ms. Johnson. And I do want to take a minute to say thank you to Ms. Omesh and Ms. Tolan for really giving us a wonderful effort today and ensuring that we had an efficient meeting that still allowed us to do some of the work that we expect to do together. We have some bumps in the road, but we'll get that cleaned up. But I do think we had a lot of questions answered today during our first session. So thank you both for your efforts.
yeah, and finally, I should acknowledge that a student had made this to the point about student initiative and student talent. So Teresa, I just wanted to make sure you know that, because I know you were a principal at once upon a time who also valued student leadership. So
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the recognition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we will send out the next step. So board members, if you can take a look at that and make sure we captured everything. Thank you very much. Everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.